Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Feruza Aripova. I am a center associate at the Davis Center and a lecturer in modern political, social, and cultural history in global context at the Cooper Union. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome both Dr. Talin Grigor and Dr. Hura Berbrian and their incredible and very timely lecture presentation titled Suitcase, Artifacts, and Translating Memory, Feminist Interventions in Writing Iranian-Armenian Diasporic Histories. Without further ado, I would like to introduce both of you. Dr. Talin Grigor is a professor of art history in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on 18th and 20th century architecture and art histories through post-colonial race, feminist, and critical theories grounded in Iran, Armeno-Iran, Armenia, and Parsi India. Her books include The Persian Revival, which was published in 2021, which was also the winner of the Saidi Serjani Book Award, Contemporary Iranian Art, published in 2014, Building Iran, one of my favorite books, published in 2009, and Persian Kingship and Architecture, published in 2015, co-edited with Susan Babei. Dr. Grigor has received fellowships from the National Gallery of Art, Getty Research Institute, Cornell's Humanities Center, Princeton's Persian Center, MIT Agahan Program, SSRC, and Persian Heritage and Kalust Gulbenkian Foundations. Her last book, co-authored with Dr. Hura Berbrian, is The Armenian Woman, Minoritarian Agency and Making of Iranian Modernity, 1860 through 1979, published in 2025. And then her current book project, The Hyphenated Architect, examines the pivotal role of ethically Armenian architects and artists in the proliferation of the modern movement in Iran and across Europe and Asia. And Dr. Hura Berbrian, welcome. Dr. Hura Berbrian is a professor of history, Miguri Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies, and director of the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research focuses on late 19th, early 20th century trans-imperial Armenian history, and especially revolutionary movements and women and gender. Her books include Armenians and Iranians' Constitutional Revolution of 1905 through 1911, published in 2001, and multiple award-winning Raving Revolutionaries, published in 2019. Again, welcome both of you, and the timing is critical. I absolutely am floored about your talk, and again, without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Feruza, and to Davis Center and to Laura. We are honored to be here and very grateful to you for organizing this talk. The horrible developments in Iran give sort of a new perspective to our presentation. Our hearts go out to the people of Iran and its foundational cultural heritage in peril. We apologize for the watermark on some of the slides that are copyrighted, so please bear with us. The blurred photograph of a woman in a traditional headgear called the god triggered a conversation about how we write women's history. A quick search revealed that it is credited to Franco-Armenian artist Kamel Levek, whose website does not source the two photos in her We Are Our Mountains series. One of the 42 plates in the 1975 Costumes of Armenian Women, the photograph was shot by British Irano-Armenian photographer of Vogue and Flair, Peter Garabedian, on the backdrop of Mount Damavand in northern Tehran. Donning the costume of the medieval kingdom of Vaspuragan around Lake Van, Angela Buksian appeared in the same dress on the Iranian national television and at the Shiraz Art Festival. She was also included in a dummy of the costume book, handed to Yerevan's History Museum by journalist Jeanette Lazarian who reported on the event that had made a global splash in mass media. On May 15, 1974, Empress Farah Pahlavi viewed these dresses on live models at Tehran's Armenian Club. A year earlier, women volunteers created these from Xerox copies of a series of postcards by Soviet ethnographer Flora Grigoryan from 1965. This unchanging traditional woman is the latest in a long chain of discursive signifiers where women in costumes serve as Partha Chatterjee's, quote, repositories of natural truth, naturally self-sustaining, and therefore timeless, unquote. In this Vosporog genealogy, however, it was women's critical and creative agency that invented, produced, reproduced, and disseminated this discourse through an erudite exhibition by a feminist Armenian women's organization. Established in 1939 by a group of students at Tehran's American Missionary High School, the Armenian Woman Union, AWU, personifies the history of Irano-Armenian women from 1860 to 1979 that Huri and I reconstructed in our recent book. Our paired presentations aim to explore the mechanics through which we amass knowledge about a minoritized group, dislodged from its diasporic site of origin, and to write their history while barred from the core archives in situ. As you will see, much of our research depended on evidence in motion. I focus on women's critical role as preservers and carriers of collective narratives through circulation of movable artifacts, from old diasporic centers in New Julfa and Tehran to new diasporic hubs in Paris, Boston, Toronto, San Francisco, LA, and yes, for some Irano-Armenians, Yerevan. This study is a how-to on how we recovered and told a story based on Lyotard's theoretical framework of little narratives, petit récit, that enables narrative knowledge extracted from and animated by what Deleuze and Guattari dubbed minor literature. Between 2019 and 23, in addition to the solitary artifacts found during some 100 successful oral interviews, about which you will hear from Huri, we documented 5 substantial private collections of co-founders and presidents of women's organizations under the custodianships of their descendants. Each collection's transfer date, route, and content map the Irano-Armenian diaspora after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Elo Mazlumian Aslanyan's photo collection revealed the prehistory of AWU, the camps, the healthy outings, and the Protestant missionary influence. Transported from Tehran to San Francisco in 1969, the timely, volunteer, and peacetime nature of their migration followed Aslanyan's prosperous American life, enabling the preservation of a wealth of fragmented but factual evidence. For instance, while one photograph confirmed the veracity of the AWU's founding myth that Irano-Armenian feminism was launched on the staircase of the American school by 9 teenagers, another confirmed that after 1947, AWU was one of the few organizations to come to the aid of the unrepatriated peasantry stranded in Tehran due to Stalin's policy reversal. Seda Darmanyan Hovnanyan's collection was transported piecemeal after she migrated to Boston in 1979 and LA in 80. Academic diplomas, a memory book, a 3-volume diary penned in the critical years between 38 and 42, and a unique set of first executive board photographs not only helped us reconstruct AWU's founding history with its commitment to disciplinary regimes, but also shed light on its co-founders' intellectual, cultural, and feminist priorities, rejecting their forerunners' charity models so common in Armenian diasporas. Emma Abrahamyan's direct relocation to Paris in the 80s, where she had been a Beaux-Arts student, enabled the safekeep of the material culture related to the costume exhibition. The 16mm film in its original metal container, the multilingual film script and photo negatives, the albums of Farah's visit and newspaper cuttings, testify to AWU's operational systematicity and a self-conscious, intentional archiving effort until the dawn of the revolution. The last two collections were transferred from Tehran to Yerevan after the fall of the Soviet Union, not by their owners, but by their custodians, who represent the latest Irano-Armenian migration pattern. When Adelina Petrosyan-Stepanyan moved to Boston from Tehran, she left behind AWU's internal archives, brochures, invitation cards, state registration documents, correspondence with international partners, drafts of bylaws and budgets, and remarkably, her formidable public speeches delivered at times to an audience of ministers and royalties. In contrast, Nina Ninish Amirkhanyan's collection contained personal items, old family photos, a notebook signed by well-known contemporaries, including Tagore, a 1902 Paris postcard, and a souvenir from the 1900 Universal Exposition. These artifacts were transported by the 18-year-old Ninish, whose return home in 1904 put her at the helm of AWBS. Launched in 1871, the Armenian Women's Society was reinstated in 1905 under AWBS, becoming the world's oldest living Armenian women's organization. Its longevity and character hinged on Ninish's 24-year presidency. The contents of her suitcase from Paris to Tehran and then from Tehran to Yerevan allowed us to reconstruct a lost history. Small in size, easily transportable, devoid of monetary value, and infused with personal meanings, these artifacts mirrored Deleuze and Guattari's minor literature with three characteristics. First, minor literature is not the literature of a minor language, but the literature a minority makes in a major language. It is invested, it involves all the ways in which the language is affected by a strong coefficient of deterritorialization. Second, everything in minor literature is political, wherein every individual matter is immediately plugged into the political. Third, since talents do not abide in a minor literature, the conditions are not given for an individuated utterance, which would be that of some master and could be separated from collective utterance. Therefore, everything has a collective value. The minor artifacts we amassed embody these three characteristics. They originated in a major culture, Iranian, by a liminal minority, Armenian and women, and imbue the traces of the majority. Each was further deterritorialized from its origin through relocation, where women carried the burden of mobility. Once moved and narrated, they chart a deterritorialized and re-territorialized diaspora in motion. Today, all 5 collections are in the care of their custodians in these new geographies. The daughter of Aslanyan and Hovnanyan preserved their collection after their death. After Abrahamian's death, her niece moved her collection to Boston, while the two Stepanians' granddaughter and sister-in-law transported theirs to Yerevan. Through matrilineal networks, each helped us identify protagonists and events where disagreements, misremembrances, misinformations, re-identifications, and reconfirmations were integral to this long and arduous process. Silent photographs yield historical data through cross-pollinations. Comparative visual investigations confirmed the veracity of textual sources, as did identifying individuals by pursuing their visual traces over organizational time and post-revolutionary censors. Conversation with these custodians in person and through social platforms proved vital when textual evidence was absent, which was the norm rather than the exception. Despite their domesticity, these artifacts are political, speaking to a history of marked feminism, how women bypassed historical power nodes, the church, the prelacy, the party boss, and directly engaged the state's own feminist and cosmopolitan aspirations. How they appropriated the aesthetics and discursive tropes of the traditional Armenian woman to be modern. How they fought back when their harshest antagonist was not the state or the conservative majority, but the nationalists within their own community who clung to the traditional woman in her outdated fashion. During interviews, we found the feminist writer and once Chega prisoner, Hélène Buzand, surrounded by AWBS members, delivering speeches about women's place in modern society. No one ever wore the coat. Organizational certificates and badges were jealously protected in albums and boxes. AWU's badge continues to trigger a sense of pride halfway across the world and allegorically does what it did then: legitimize organizational authority, machinate belonging, perform the politics of inclusion and exclusion, and state a socio-institutional status. I have a badge, you don't. In their capitalist worthlessness, they represent an object that was permitted to trespass the nation state, where most valuables, jewelry, artworks, and properties could not. In other collections, the same badge reemerged with the same sense of curation and pride. Suitcase artifacts also consistently carry collective value. Former members were our main source of organizational documents, bylaws, programs, and self-published anniversary volumes. An interviewee tapped into her network among Glendale, California's New Julfin women to collect for us what she missed in her own collection. Pointing to two singers displayed in her living room, she told of the dexterity with which her Mercy Union had educated generations of girls who went on to contribute to Iranian society. Another New Julfin proudly presented her grandmother's bed cover, tablecloth, and handicraft, which she brought in her suitcase to Glendale in 1989. Her custodianship exemplifies Khachik Tololyan's concrete acts of collective representation sustained over time, where filial ties to 17th century Esfahan and the Armenian Apostolic Church are sustained. Here, for example, you see her grandfather was actually a priest in the church. Although the singers and the embroideries were of no interest to us, we soon realized that the big facts, Lyotard's meta-narratives, mattered little in the narration of these artifacts. The mix-up of world wars and kings was a common and consistent mishap. What really mattered was Lyotard's petit récit, activated by minor artifacts through the agency of these women against the grain of patriarchal pomposity and the apathy of the next generation. Decade after decade, she preserves the photographs and their corresponding post-it and makes them speak, enabling a reconstruction of an old New Julfan family with tentacles in women's organizations worldwide, including Java. In effect, what women keep and narrate out of their suitcase is not a set of household items, outdated tablecloths, or unwashable, unironable bed covers. What women point to is not a singer, but a feminist history in the old diaspora that turned women unpaid labor into economic capital to benefit their communities. In the new diasporic centers, these objects mend exilic ruptures and, when triggered, produce knowledge. The stories women were telling us, as they were telling us, were occasionally negated by their family members. You should read books instead of listening to her stories, one medical doctor suggested. These stories Lyotard calls narrative knowledge in a binary juxtaposition to scientific knowledge, where the former does not have priority to the question of its own legitimization and that it certifies itself in the pragmatics of its own transmission without having recourse to argument and proof. We witnessed the unfolding of the mechanics through which male relatives portrayed our interviewees' narratives as Lyotard's, quote, fables, myths, legends fit only for women and children, unquote. Visual and material sources transported and quietly preserved across 3 continents and over 4 decades legitimize these women's fables as history. Our historical and art historical disciplinary methods translated these fragmented little narratives into a historically grounded scholarly text. We documented with an acute awareness that we were collecting the archives of a disappearing diaspora. Yet few were reluctant to remove covers, frames, and boxes. We only heard about the exhibition's 16mm film and eventually watched it secretly on WhatsApp from Tehran. A Toronto-based custodian first sent homemade pictures of the exhibition's unique posters, and you can see there her grandchildren's little fingers, only parting with it 3 years later to be professionally processed and become our book cover. My wedding dress was inspired by the trapezon model, said an interviewee. It was a gift from my friend to sew it for me. All my maids of honor were also in costume from that book. Activating the core mission of AWU's exhibition, that is to interject Armenian women's agency in Armenian historiography, the wedding dress copied and reproduced model 28 Vaspuragan rather than trapezon in all its details. Not just recreating the form signifier, i.e. the dress, but also its mechanics of self-validation and legitimization through appropriation and copying. It turns out that the traditional woman exists insofar as the creative and critical author of a discourse which demands an intellectual process, a feminist upbringing, a self-conscious education in history, a self-aware commitment to research, selection, design, and production of a so-called traditional dress solely to perform the rituals of nationhood. Instead of the embodiment of Chatterjee's national tradition and spiritual domain, these women are authors of Lyotard's Little Narratives who preserve and curate Deleuze and Guattari's minor artifacts in their suitcases, sedentarizing diasporic temporalities and geographies. In that transnational diasporic life, these women represent Tololian's nodes in its networks that continue to enable the production of the cultural work that sustains diasporas. They are the objects of knowledge who talk back not only to the ways they are reported in media and administration, but also to disciplinary scholarly discourses.
Following Tani's focus on the role of visual and material cultural sources in revealing the unrecorded lives of Iranian women on the move, I will delve into the equally fragmented diasporic memory evident in oral interviews. My talk considers the major methodological challenges of conducting research and constructing a history whose presence is laced with absences and complicated by the memory of a mobile diasporic community of Irano-Armenian women, where the matrilineal legacies are often forgotten or neglected, and yet it is the women who consistently and predominantly do the remembering and retelling, preserving memories and material. The memory landscape, however, remains always blurred, as oral recollections or memories are malleable, reconstructed under the heavy weight of the recaller's presence, that is, with certain social frameworks, cadre social, as well as diasporic pressures and the nostalgia of our interviewees, whether in Iran or in exile in North America, Europe, Armenia. The moment of creativity or reconstruction of memory due to interviewer prompts is as important as the experienced past. The archival silences, combined with the privileging of Ottoman Armenian history or the unfamiliarity with Armenian among most researchers, have led to scholarly silences. Although relatively numerically small, Irano-Armenians' engagement and impact in many spheres, from their significant role fighting a constitution in Iran's first revolution to serving as its top nation-building architects, have been considerable, yet too often relegated to the margins of Armenian and Iranian histories. Moreover, the community's women have received almost no scholarly attention, as nationalist historical writing has rarely deemed women worthy of study. At times echoing the discursive gaps, former activists categorically declined to participate in knowledge production, in part due to exilic and institutional ruptures and a gendered upbringing that regards talking about one's socio-political engagements as boastful and therefore unseemly for women. And yet, pre-revolutionary leaders of these very organizations actively sought to create knowledge, honing the bond between knowledge and power. The hesitation of women to talk is compounded by the patriarchal custom of dropping their maiden surnames, also markers of patrilineage, and taking on the husband's name, thus impeding a researcher's ability to trace the matrilineage of activism through formal archives, themselves repositories of erasure, which has been compounded by physical loss. In response, in the book and here, we choose to employ both women's maiden names and surnames in a concerted effort to remedy century-long fractured matrilineages and preserve reconstructed connections. Thus, the politics of naming acts as a methodological as well as an emancipatory tactic on our part. Revolutionary rupture and the global dispersion of the Armenian community have had further deleterious effects on the accessibility and even survival of archives. Even when archives exist, as with those of Armenian women's organizations, there has been a tendency to safeguard them from the peering eyes of researchers, often viewed with suspicion. In cases when archival documents have been preserved, we face their fragmentary nature because of neglect, disposal, or loss. In the face of these hurdles, Informal archives, interviews alongside family collections of photos and papers, languishing in treasured but unopened boxes, unfurled a lush landscape of storytelling, photos, letters, keepsakes, and with them a sense of rediscovery by many women who were either themselves or their predecessors once at the helm of social, cultural, and intellectual activism. We contacted about 200 people and conducted about 100 useful interviews, largely in person, some virtually, and very few in writing. Most interviewees were Irano-Armenian women. Only 3 were men. All left Iran during the 78-79 revolution or after Islamization under the Islamic Republic. 4 the United States, Armenia, France, and some, of course, stayed in Iran. All were either directly involved in or indirectly through grandmothers, great aunts, mothers, and aunts, associated with women's organizations in Iran, especially the Armenian Woman Union, AWU, that Tallinn spoke about earlier. Our goal was to both acquire information about the origins, development, and work of the organizations and the women at their helm, and to comprehend how the interviewees viewed and their forebears may have understood their own activism. Many helped us rethink the loud silences and absences, as well as the relationship of these women and the organizations in relation to the woman question and feminism. All interviews and our post-interview reflections about remembrance took place with the recognition that there is no such thing as pure recollection, but a piece of truth that remains about a world that is gone. In 1957, when Nevart Masumian took on the responsibility of constructing the complex origins and long history of the earliest women's organization in Iran, the predecessor of the Armenian Women's Benevolent Society, AWBS, of which she was a member, she opened her narrative by stressing the dearth of documentation and her own reliance on memory. Our research into women's organizations has encountered similar but even more serious challenges in constructing a history whose presence remains bound up with absences. The post-revolutionary exodus of around 90% of Armenians from Iran, coupled with limitations on self-expression, has aggravated these hindrances. Whether in the archives, scholarship, historical memory, or with historical actors, the women themselves, the silences remain persistent, as we encountered women who, despite evidence to the contrary, proclaimed, "I haven't done anything," or "I don't remember anything," thus refusing to take control of their own narrative. We could interpret these statements and behavior in a variety of ways, from an internalized sense of marginality, implying what we or they did wasn't a big deal, or sincere humility, or perhaps even false modesty, intended to signal a societally accepted virtue for women, or even perhaps a strategy of power. What do I mean by this? While women who express modesty seem to relinquish agency and power by refusing to talk about and for themselves, they may also be subconsciously or consciously transferring the power to more traditional communal centers of power, such as church or political leadership, thus sanctioning them to convey the importance of their own, that is, women's actions. In some cases, interviewees would ask that what they considered certain sensitive details about their activist mothers or grandmothers, or unsympathetic comments they made about others, not be shared. Some asked that we stop recording until they completed their comments. We believe these cautionary requests are bound intimately with the dictates of networks in motion, as they serve to maintain social networks and practices that help sustain one's social connections on which double diasporized Irano-Armenians rely. Fully plugged into their new communities, whether in North America, Europe, or Armenia, they are compelled or necessitated to perform a set of finesse niceties and obligations. It was indeed those networks that enabled us to tap into them through Tallinn's family and community networks and her own parents' activist contacts, thereby facilitating our interviews. This social arrangement, with its duties and considerations transported from Iran, is maintained specifically in the older generations who lived much of their adult lives in Iran, and less so perhaps with younger generations, although it is not completely absent among them. Lest I give the impression that silences and absences dominated, I want to focus on a topic that often emerged palpably in our interviews or lay just beneath the surface: feminism. We began our research with a very vague understanding of these organizations' agendas, hesitant to use the term feminist. Through the interviews, we realized that members of organizations held a wide range of perceptions about themselves and about mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and so forth. Thus, we began to adjust our own perceptions, informed in addition by women's writings, feminist translations, as well as their own actions. All of these demonstrated the applicability of Samuel Shager's claim to our interviews, that the complexity of truth gets probed from many angles of vision, but there is no choice about being inside or outside the dialogue. Everyone is part of it, invested with a participant's responsibility for sifting through what he or she has lived. They also clarified in our minds the potential and reality of an Irano-Armenian brand of feminism, especially among AWU founders and members, but also present among what would be considered conventional charitable organizations, confirming the point made by Nazan Maksudian in the Ottoman-Armenian case, that we should be cautious about drawing a distinct line between charitable, assumed to be apolitical, and feminist, accepted as being political. Hovering over photos from the 30s and 40s of young adult women on country outings and hikes on the Alborz Mountains, strewn all over the table in her San Francisco home, the daughter of an AW founder remembered her mother, Elo Mazlumian Aslanyan, as very progressive in her thinking and her attitudes towards women, adding, she never thought that her daughters lacked anything or were in any way behind men. As a self-proclaimed feminist of the highest degree herself, she recognized feminism in her own mother and the other founders of AWU. She elaborates on the co-founders. For their time, they were definitely feminists. They were definitely ahead of their time, definitely interested in the advancement of Armenian women, particularly Irano-Armenian women. Referring to AW's founding soon after the closing down of Armenian schools by Reza Shah in 1936, she connects this form of activism, teaching young Armenian girls, with promoting women's empowerment. This connection also points to another common element brought forth in interviews and in our research, the intimate relationship between nationalism and feminism, so common in women's movements since the mid-19th century. As Ellen Fleischman argues for the Palestinian case, Irano-Armenian women's organizations too created and shaped an indigenous feminism, seeking, quote, individual autonomy in order to enable women to participate in public life and make choices in their personal life, but primarily in order to serve a collectivity, the nation, end quote. For Irano-Armenian women, indigenous feminism meant both an everyday lived feminism and direct action aimed at improving women's lives. Pointing to her mother, Mazlumian Aslanyan's pride in her feminism and her own as well, one daughter clarified her mother's thought process. It wasn't as if we are doing this just as Armenian women. We are just doing this as women. That's what I remember. Her sister jumped in to qualify her sister's strident statements by reassuring us or herself that her mother's feminism was a, quote, soft feminism, and not the feminism of Gloria Steinem, as she put it. Sometimes speaking simultaneously and expounding on the idea of what feminism meant for their mother as they understood it, the sisters agreed that their mother was not a militant, but instead an intellectual feminist. A granddaughter of AWBS founder and president, Ninish Amirkhanyan Stepanyan, clearly saw her grandmother as a feminist. My grandmother staunchly believed in equal coeducation. In our family, women's freedom and women's rights were vehemently defended. I was equal to any of the boys. She also recounted a family lore as evidence. My grandparents believed that during summer, both girls and boys had to cut their hair short. The Jeanne d'Arc nuns called them to school and asked why on earth had they cut their girls' hair so short. My grandmother told them that we believe in equality, and this is how we raise our girls. Just like boys, girls' hair needs to be cut short. In a similar vein, another daughter of an AW founder, Seda Darmanyan-Hovnanian, ascribed feminism to her mother and the organization. I am sure Haigin, that is Armenian Women Union's mandate, was exactly that, feminism. Haigin, Armenian woman. Absolutely. No man was ever involved in their work. Never. Adding that her mother believed in equality. The daughter of an AW board member agreed. They participated in debate. They dealt with clergy, archbishop. These women needed to be able to sit and look you in the face and give you what they believed in and push it forward. So they were not your everyday sandwich-making women. Like Mazlumian Aslanyan's daughters, Darmanyan Hovnanian's daughter too saw her mother as an intellectual and a feminist, recalling, in our home, Mom was a stronger personality. She made all the decisions. For example, at the time, it was unheard of for the bank accounts to be in both husband and wife's names. Everything was by both of their names. She definitely believed that women and men must be equal. They have to be similarly educated, have careers. Other women had similar memories of these financial markers of feminism and equality. One even joked, my dad would give all his paycheck to my mom and would ask for a little bit of cash back, adding, feminism was understood. Darmanyan Hovnanian's son, however, had trouble coming to terms with the fact that his mother was one of the teen co-founders of AWU. He believed some AW members, but not his intensely timid mother, had feminist leanings. He singled out Mazlumian Aslanyan as a very strong woman who had that feminist attitude. He concluded, in Iran, we hadn't even heard the word feminist and didn't know such a thing exists. Here we encounter a sister and a brother with very divergent views about their mother's activism, the former expressing appreciation and pride in their mother's feminism, and the latter betraying his own gender biases and dismissing their mother's involvement. Like Darmanyan Hovnanian's son, a few rejected the notion of feminism altogether. For some, a rejection of feminist leanings was bound to their own notion that Armenian women had already arrived, surpassing their Muslim sisters in Iran. Their memories centered around developments during the Pahlavi period. While Reza Shah had forced the unveiling of Iranian women in 1936, his son Mohammad Reza Shah oversaw a period of unprecedented material wealth, coupled with a top-down policy of rapid urbanization and bourgeoisification, and state policies on women, which revised their legal status, granting women the right to vote in 1963, and led to some societal changes in their status. The sweeping modernization of the late Pahlavi era meant that, encouraged by state policies, women, including Irano-Armenian women, entered higher education and the professions in droves and broke new ground in several arenas. One former AW member proclaims, we had all the rights at that time. Another insists, believe me, not a moment in my life I have felt suppressed. A niece of AW leaders elaborated, there's a difference of value where the Muslim woman is not equal to the man. In Iran, Armenian girls were not looked down upon. We were never brought up to think that women were any less than men. This idea that Armenian women were far ahead of their Muslim sisters in Iran was a common refrain and one developed or strengthened in exile. Looking back at pre-Islamic Iran under the Pahlavis and perhaps forgetful of the patriarchal community and society in which they lived, no doubt the women we interviewed were very conscious of the differences in policies and treatment of women between the two regimes and societies, and became nostalgic about bygone days. A committee member and model for AWU exhibition expressed similar sentiments, widening the arena to include not just women, but Armenians as a whole. We had everything. The state gave us a lot of opportunities, and we benefited from them. And now we don't have it. I go to Iran every 4 years and return with a lot of pain. It's so painful. This longing for an almost lost paradise, where the Irano-Armenian community prospered, saw expression in reminiscences about women's solidarity and their organizations, which especially the latter have not traveled with them. Interviewees spoke of the way the core AW founders worked so well together, relying on each other, corresponding from wherever their exile had taken them, and remaining friends throughout their lives. Darmanyan Hovnanian's daughter, for example, revealed, those friendship ties were kept through the organization until the end of their lives. The work was so meaningful to them that it kept them close and intimate. These lifelong bonds, which endured in their new diasporic existence, reveal the impact of a shared cause that sustained them in mobility. These lasting connections correlate with deep matrilineal networks of activist mothers whose commitment to a volunteer ethos and the memory and recounting of it has passed down to their daughters, granddaughters, nieces, and grandnieces across borders, from Iran to diasporic communities in Europe and North America, and to Armenia. Their heirs continue to be motivated by the activism of the women in their families and carry forward their work. Their female forebears' labor for educational, intellectual, and cultural advancement, combined with a devoted struggle to improve and enhance the lives of women, has opened the path for them to continue their legacy in motion, in their homes, away from home, in exilic existence, whether in diaspora or in Armenia. Thank you from both of us.
Thank you so much for this incredible, groundbreaking, really, work that is so majorly contributes to the whole intersectional global feminist movement. I am immensely, immensely grateful to both of you for your work, for your research, and really bringing these marginalized voices to the surface. We will open the floor to questions, and while perhaps the participants gather their thoughts after, again, this amazing talk, I had a question that I know that you've been touring really around the globe with this work. And again, I want to reiterate the title of your book, The Armenian Woman, Minoritarian Agency and the Making of Iranian Modernity, 1860 through 1979. So you've been touring the globe with multiple presentations about your work. What has been response from the Armenian diaspora, especially women's voices, and also has it prompted more narratives coming to the surface? Have people come up to you and share their stories?
Well, maybe I can start. And so we have had we were surprised how excited people were when we were giving the talk. And we were actually surprised of the generational difference. We initially thought that only people who remember or have lived this history would react to us, but we had we had 20-year-old, 18-year-olds who came up, bought the book, asked us to sign it, asked us to what to write in the signature. We also had people who, women who had been themselves young activists, some of them in tears, seeing this history being written. Marie, you want to add?
Yes, it has actually been incredible in terms of seeing women feel like they've been heard for the first time, that their story has been considered important enough to be studied. And themselves, as I said partly in the paper about the interviewees, the audience members too, feeling empowered by the story that they heard. And we hope that this leads to more studies being done on the subject, but I think that time will tell whether that will happen or not.
Thank you so much. And then we have the first question by Valerie Sperling, one of our co-chairs. You pointed out that 90% of the Armenian community in Iran left after the 1979 revolution. Are there any Armenian women's organization in Iran today, or does the regime forbid that?
Yeah. So 90%, I don't know if you said 90 or 98, so forgive me if I'm correcting you for no reason, but 90% left. And the same organizations that we talk about in the book, all the major ones anyway, continue to exist and continue to function, but in a very different capacity, largely charitable. AWU's Armenian Woman Union's last guest invited to Iran was the feminist poet and translator Alicia Giragosyan, and she came in in 77. And when the revolution began, that was basically the end of feminist activity for AWU and for other women's organizations.
I'm just going to add that the state, actually, the Islamic Republic, see these charity organizations as a partner. They are a way of maintaining elder people's homes, providing. I'm sure now that the situation now, many of these women's organizations are going to be the ones that are taking care of the Armenian families. So they actually see them as assets. The government sees these organizations as assets to take care of the Armenian minorities in partnership with the state.
Okay. Also, if any of the participants have more questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. Huri, you mentioned something in relation to many of the participants refusing to use the word feminism. And also, for example, in my research, when I was addressing the whole contested campaign of unveiling, which is, of course, seen as feminist, and yet, again, there are these fragments of, it's very fragmented, right? So perhaps could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
So, I mean, this is not something that is limited to obviously the historical women in these histories. I have students who live basically feminist lives who say I'm not a feminist. So there's an association with feminism that people make that is militant, bra burning, etc. And it's sort of trying to distance themselves from that kind of feminism and not being more reflective about what feminism is, the varieties of feminism, indigenous feminism in the case of Armenians or others. So I think that was the case. Of course, there were, and others thought, we actually didn't need feminism because we already had all the rights. We had arrived, we were there. It was unnecessary. And then there were those who were against feminism or didn't understand feminism, but those were fewer. But a lot of them were basically saying, why did we didn't need feminism. We already had everything we needed.
Colleen, would you like to add anything regarding that?
Just to say that at the very beginning, we were, as Uri said in her paper, we were very, very hesitant with the use of the term, and then we started the. So one thing that happened was that we were planning to first go to Iran in 2019, and then of course go to Europe and to Armenia to do our research. But then COVID happened. So when COVID happened, we immediately switched to the interviews, and many of these interviews were in they were accessible to us because we didn't have to travel. So sort of the interview part, just because of COVID lockdown, came before the archival research. And so then this landscape of conversations and attitudes and approaches came from during the interviews. Um, and we were still hesitant. We were sort of trying to figure out where is the feminism, or and then after COVID, when we did go to the archives and we did read and had access to the writings of these women, all of a sudden it became so evidently clear that they were translating Betty Friedan in Armenian and publishing it in Tehran. I don't know if you can be more feminist than that. Along with, all the waves of feminism they were translating in short parts, but they were publishing it in the main party organ in Tehran, the Alik daily. So then we realized that it was interesting, these interviews and these perceptions, these sort of 40 years delay memories, and then what we found in newspapers and in their own writings. And then we're definitely using the word feminism because that was what it was.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So there are two questions from Elizabeth Wood. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm curious about the watermark on so many photos. That's number one. And the second question is, I love the discussion of suitcases. Did your women explicitly discuss how they decided what to take?
Thank you for the question. So the watermarks is because, and during our own book talks, we have been very careful not to record or live stream our book talk. But this is not our book talk, in part because we are careful that the history that we are reviving is not going to negatively impact anyone or any organization, women's organization in Iran. So that's and also the watermarks are there because almost all of these items come from these private collections. So, and obviously private collections or these women's collections, and that is what I try to argue, they don't automatically tap into any copyright systems. So they don't, so we as authors, as scholars, we have to make sure that their copyrights are protected. And so that's the reason for the watermark, and in part because this talk is going to be accessible digitally on various platforms. So that's the reason for the watermark. The other question was that women, yes, they told us why they brought some things, although it was, for most of them, they weren't articulating why they picked these 5 objects, but it was sort of understood that these 5 objects were the most important thing. So we had a couple of the exhibition models. So the exhibition had 42 models, and then 44 of them ended up in the exhibition catalog. And we interviewed almost over half of them we found, and the ones that we didn't find, they were already deceased, or they just we couldn't find them. But some of them said, I brought the book because it was that event, the 1974 exhibition, was one of the most important event in their lives. It was that culmination of their public life. And so if they had to pick one thing, it was the catalog that they brought with it. And we already had like 3 or 4 copies of the catalog, but every interview we went, someone would give us, like, I have the catalog. Do you want this? We're like, okay, we have like the old version, the new version, because it was trilingual. So it was English, Armenian, and Persian. Some of them didn't have the Persian version in it. So we had all the versions, but every time we went to an interview, that was the item that would come out. But some of the other, for example, the tablecloth, the handicraft, I mean, a lot of people had this. Photographs were very important. Sort of these family albums and family collections that came out, we weren't sure if they were useful to us in terms of writing women's organizational history. But then we realized that it had other important function in terms of this idea of mobility, of sustaining diasporas through suitcase artifacts.
Yeah, and it was an interesting sort of irony in the sense that these were incredibly important items for them, but often they were in these boxes that were in storage in a part of the house and hadn't been opened for who knows how long. So sometimes when we approached people, women, they'd be like, yeah, I have things, but I need some time to get the boxes out. So they're treasured items, and yet they're stored and put away, so, not out in the open or not looked at very often. So it's rather interesting for us to see that.
And some of the boxes we never accessed some of the boxes. I mean, there were a few boxes that
were promised but not delivered.
We have another question from Valerie. Of course, families want to hang on to their relatives' archival materials for personal reasons, but did you talk with any of the descendants of the AWU founders about maybe collectively creating a museum archive somewhere for their artifacts? Would any museums be interested? And that also, I had a similar question, whether you envision to create an exhibit, a visual exhibit based on the materials that you've collected.
So when we were documenting, we already had this idea of a collection, an archival collection that would enable more research. And we still want to do that. In terms of the exhibition, because these are very treasured personal items that now have an added diasporic meaning to the families. We never took away any item from anyone, even documents. I mean, we were even hesitant to say, can we take these to scan it professionally and bring it back? We documented everything, but on the spot, when we were in their homes. And so we have a lot of digital materials, but we don't have the physical item, with the exception of the poster that I mentioned in my talk. The poster, first of all, we didn't know there was a poster. And then when we contacted one of the models in Toronto, she was absolutely thrilled that we are writing this history. Then she sent a photo of the poster with her grandchildren's little fingers. We tried to, when we came to, I mean, a few years later, when we had written book and we were thinking about the cover, we thought that would make a great cover because it was designed by a professional graphic designer who was an important graphic designer in the 70s in Iran in general. But we couldn't get rid of the little fingers, and the quality wasn't high res enough. And then we contacted her again, and this was post-COVID. This was post 2002 war with Azerbaijan over Artsakh. So she just said, I'm gonna part with it. And so the poster arrived, but it had not been opened for 40 years. So it was in this sort of ossified, rolled up format. And so it had to be professionally opened and scanned. And then it became the cover. And she was absolutely thrilled, and we were absolutely thrilled. So these objects, they have their own lives. And the poster was an example. So we do have the poster, but not maybe we will do an exhibition, but I'm not sure if we have enough of physical material to make a compelling exhibition.
And if we were thinking about sort of housing these in an archive somewhere, it would, I think, have to be digital, and we would have to go back to the people to get a different kind of permission, because it would be irresponsible of us to do it without another permission from them.
And I think that is also true about the interviews. I mean, the interviews are a wealth of material for researchers, future researchers, but they need to be processed. Some of the parts need to be. So that's another large.
And they're largely in Armenian. So which adds another layer of complexity.
Thank you. A question from Rochelle Rothschild, which is related to what we just talked about. Thank you so much for your presentation. Did the owners of these private collections make any arrangements for their preservation outside their families? And would that be possible?
So we know of a few who have actually donated some photographs to digital archives online. But I think in general, Tallinn, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they have made any arrangements, but except for a few.
Yeah, and what is more is that many of these women they knew the value of these collections, not only to the family, but also to diasporic history, Armenian history. But they were also worried about how their descendants, their children and grandchildren, busy with mortgage and, the next, they don't really understand the value of these, and they were afraid. Many of them were afraid that once they're gone, it's going to go to some thrift store or something like that. So that's also part of the dynamics of diasporic life, where there are these ruptures, and some things lose value because you haven't experienced them, you haven't lived with these objects. So no, most of them don't, and some of them, the owners themselves, those who carried them here, are worried that they might not end up in the right place. But we're hopeful that our book might change some people's minds.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we don't have any more questions. I just wanted to ask whether perhaps there's anything else that you didn't cover in your presentation, or we, because it was kind of very concise, that anything else you wanted to elaborate on from both of you, coming from, because you're very sort of cohesive, but yet separate in what you talked about. So if there's anything else you wanted to address.
I mean, we're coming from very different disciplines. I mean, not very different, but different disciplines. Art history for Tali and history for me. So, and coming together to do this book was illuminating for both of us. We learned a lot from the other discipline. I'm very textual. I read, I see words. She sees images. I don't necessarily see images. I've changed, but of course not the same way. So it was both challenging and very productive collaboration. And Tallinn, if you want to tell a story, you love telling that one story of me
Uh,
going.
oh yes, so I can tell two stories. So I totally agree. I mean, we learned so much from the other ways of seeing the evidence, um, and and it was truly an effort and a learning experience to be collaborative and interdisciplinary. And the book would not have happened if we weren't really collaborating. I mean, I think we talk a lot about interdisciplinary, but it really means something, and it really means seeing how another field deals with evidence. So two stories. The first, once we could go to Europe, we went to Bibliothèque Nubar, which is in Paris, and they had brought folders. One of the folders were a whole folder of photographs. And so Huri took the folder, she literally did, and she's like, almost sort of half eye, she looked at it and she's like, no, we don't need these. And I was floored. I was like, I think
This is not
this collaboration is over. I'm like, where are you taking these? I mean, not only I haven't looked at it, but also like, that's not how you read images. Like you spend at least half an hour on one photograph. And so then she was right. There was nothing in there for us, but it was interesting how she was reading photographs and how I consider reading photographs. And then the other, couple of years later, or maybe more, we had already done the research. I had done these, trying to figure out who these women are, because as Huri mentioned, when they drop their maiden name, you lose track of who they are. So particularly this one woman who was active, so she comes from Isfahan, she's active there, then she moves to Abadan, she's active there, moves to Tehran, and then she ends up in LA. And so we could trace her activism through basically looking for her portrait in different anniversary volumes. And so we had done this, and so someone gave us a journal cover with a portrait on it. And I was like, oh my God, Uri, this is that, she's there and she went there. This is this person. And Uri's like, yeah, I know. The name is on the bottom of their portrait. I'm like, oh yes. So it was interesting that she reads and I'm like focused on the image on the same page. But really, this was a collaboration of methods that made the book possible.
And needless to say, you're both so brilliant. So coming together, as I said, the work is just really, truly groundbreaking. We have another question from Elizabeth Wood. I teach a course on gender and archives, so my students will be very interested to hear your talk. Can you tell us about how you cross-reference the different parts of your materials, as you showed us in the photo with yellow and red underlining? How did you try to get all the information? You talked about the problem of maiden names. What were some of the hardest nuts to crack, and how did you literally mark up photocopies? I want my students to hear your talk.
Go ahead, Tom.
I'm not. You answer. I'm not sure. I completely understand.
The question is how we cross-reference. So when we came across certain a name, and it was unclear to us what the relationship, if any, was to previous organizational leaders, we did a few things. Tallinn, of course, went to the visual. And I searched, for example, the newspapers, the Armenian language newspapers at the time in Tehran. So looking for obituaries, looking for articles that connected people, or even like, there were little stories about, oh, so and so, the daughter of so and so acquired this award or grant or something of that sort. So I took that route of trying to cross-reference, and Tallinn did similar things, not only in anniversary compilations by these organizations, but through photos.
Yes, so I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out who is who. And over time, so trying actually to see how certain women are moving, but their portrait or their first name, I mean, sort of the first name under a portrait became an important connecting point. And also the executive board photographs, these were very important because you could tell that this is a woman who looks like this, and then 10 years later, she has a different last name, but and is 10 years older, but she still looks sort of like the same person. So photographs were important, but also oral histories. I mean, several times we went back to a few people who had given us a very good, I mean, they were old enough to have been participants, active participants in the organization, but they were, you could tell that they remember well. So they knew who was who, and that was another thing that some people just didn't want to remember or couldn't remember certain things, and there were others who remembered really well. So I would take the pictures of these executive board pictures, and I would go back to some of our interviewees and say, can you identify these? Can you identify? There was one photo that we published in our book. I mean, there were 4 photos that we published in our books of AWU founders and as well as AWBS. We started with knowing one person out of 20 people standing in the portrait, and we ended up identifying every person in that photo, and creating a genealogy of who was there from the beginning, who dropped and went somewhere else, and who remained until after the revolution.
And what Tallinn said about the going back to the interviewees, that was something that we didn't actually talk about, is that I mentioned sort of in the paper, is that if it weren't for the important the place that Tallinn has in the Iranian-Armenian community. As an Iranian-Armenian, I'm Lebanese-Armenian. If it weren't for her and her family connections, it would have been really difficult to do these interviews because there's a certain suspicion about talking to someone that's not from inside the community. And so there's that element as well to this whole story. And it's that networking that makes the book also possible. Another kind of discipline, networking.
You want to tell your story about the interview?
Yeah, sometimes during interviews, I mean, we would go in. I've published books on Iranian-Armenian, so people assume if they know that, they assume that I'm Iranian-Armenian. And if they don't know that, me going into their home to interview about a book on Iranian-Armenian women makes them assume that I'm from Iran. And so a few times when I started speaking, because we speak different standards of Armenian, it was very obvious I was not from Iran. And so there was that initial, oh, you're not from Iran. But, they soon, got over that.
And just to add that, some of these women, for them, we weren't just a couple of hours of interview and then they were done. We felt that for some of these, it was continuation of their activism. Every time, out of the blue, we would call because we were stuck on a detail during the writing, and they were like, yes, just call whenever, So for them, they were invested in this project. Themselves, they were invested in this project. And so in that sense, too, they were part of this preservation of the history, this preservation of diasporic through what Tololian calls the cultural work that you need to do to preserve a diaspora.
I really would like again to reiterate again in the context of the upcoming International Women's Day, how important, critical your work comes with such a major force by addressing all these fragmented notions of diaspora, feminism, gender, language, history. I am just so immensely grateful to both of you for taking your time to speak and really enlighten us. And I personally hope and envision that your digital exhibit will come in force, and it would be just so important for not only for the diaspora, for the diasporic communities, but also for women in the diaspora to have that memory palpable and accessible. And we have no more questions. And if you would like to deliver your final remarks, please, the floor is yours.
I don't have any final remarks except to express my gratitude and appreciation for having us here and for the work that you do. So thank you. It was actually a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Feruza, and all the participants, and Laura for the technical organization of everything. We're grateful here, and also we're really our hearts go out to the people of Iran. For me personally, what is happening, the destruction that is happening is devastating, because some of the not only the people but also the cultural heritage is being destroyed. But Iranians are resilient people, and maybe we should end on a note of hope.
Yes, we will end on a note of hope and resilience. Thank you so much to the Davis Center, and particularly Laura, for helping organizing this incredible event that I really enjoyed. Again, it's been a great pleasure hosting you both, and thank you so much for all of your, again, immense, wonderful, brilliant insight. And I look forward to seeing you in New York sometime soon. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and the talk will be available online for anyone who wants to access it later. Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, I celebrate you both and celebrate womanhood and intersectionality.